The information discussed on this podcast is for general educational purposes only and is not legal advice. Listening does not create an attorney-client relationship. In this episode, Lou is actually the guest. Donald Campbell, Executive Director of the Atlantic Center for Independent Living, invited Lou onto his show to talk about disability rights, criminal justice, and how the system really treats people with disabilities in New Jersey. Donald kindly let us share that full conversation here on Lou's Boardwalk Esquire podcast. So what you're about to hear first aired on Atlantic Center for Independent Living's own channel and is being cross-posted with their permission. Welcome to the show.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Atlantic Cell podcast. I have a guest that I actually haven't talked to in a long time, despite talking to for a long time. When I did see him more constantly, he's actually my former note taker, so I guess he deserves some credit for me succeeding in life. He could have sucked and I could have failed at a Stockton. But hi, Lewis.
Donald, how are you?
Lewis, how do you say your last name? I always say it wrong.
Casadia.
So Lewis and I went to Stockton together, and we were in classes together, both in pre-law, and, we both went to law school, and he actually practiced law instead of with me, who went to the lucrative nonprofit field. And so that's what I have him here for, to talk about law school and criminal law and all that stuff, and how disability sometimes is a factor in our legal system. Because, Lewis, you were a former prosecutor too, right?
I was.
Yeah, so let's talk about, now you're a defense attorney and have your own practice, which was interesting to me because, like I said, I knew you when we were in college. So how did you end up, how did you end up as a prosecutor and then switching to a defense attorney? Let's start there.
Well, if you want the honest to God's truth, when I left law school, or when I graduated law school, I started off with a clerkship with Judge Porto down in Cape May. He did criminal law. And I actually initially applied for the public defender's office. I didn't really, I always saw myself as someone who could do either or. Like, I could be a prosecutor, I could be a public defender, like, or, private attorney. It didn't really, like, I wasn't one who was like, I can never be a prosecutor, I can never be a defense attorney. The reason, honestly, that I applied to the public defender's office is that they just had a more stable contract and pay scale. So that's where I started off. I applied there, and I got to the second round of interviews, and they didn't hire me. So I was all right, back to the drawing board, and I sent my resumes out to all the prosecutors' offices, and I got hired in Burlington, and that's going back to 2016. I started there. I stayed there for about 3 years, had a few trials, and then I applied and got hired down in Atlantic County, where it's my home county. I always kind of wanted to come back down here ultimately. So, 3 years in, it made sense to make the move. I did that. I stayed down there for 4 years. And in January 2024, it's when I said, you know what? I want to be my own boss. And, I took the leap, hung a shingle, and here I am. So that's the long and short of it.
Yeah. Yeah, so being your own boss definitely has its benefits and its issues, because when something goes wrong,
Sure does.
when something goes wrong, it really is all your fault. And
Yeah.
it doesn't
Even if it's not my fault, it's my fault.
Right,
It
exactly.
doesn't really matter if it's not my fault.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
But
So did you, was your plan always to go and be a defense attorney, or was it just like a strategic, was it just like time you wanted your own?
I always had it in my head that I was going to do it one day. For those listening who are in similar situations as I was going to let my pension vest. And so I was kind of waiting for the 10-year mark. I was at like year 7, and I just did the math, and I'm like, this just doesn't, the math just didn't make sense for me to wait any longer. Like, I I would say like once you hit year 5 as a prosecutor, like you always learn new stuff. Like
Right.
even now, I'm still learning new stuff. Like that's not what I'm saying, but like when you hit year 5, like I think the amount of, especially if you're in there trying cases and litigating like for a long period of time as a prosecutor, like you kind of the gains of staying as far as learning things and how things work, like it decreases. Like you've learned a good
Right.
chunk after 5 years. You
Right.
always learn more stuff, but at that point, there's not a lot of reasons to stay in terms of experience as long as you've spent those 5 years well. And I
Right.
and I did. I was lucky enough. I had a lot of trials and I had a lot of like time and experience in. So at year 7, I'm just sitting there and, I'm kind of just going through the motions, waiting for the 10-year mark. And I kind of just spreadsheeted my, what does this look like if I vest? Like,
Sounds like you.
yeah. So I ran the numbers and I'm like, this, it could, it's one of those things where it depends when you die.
Yeah.
Like as a prosecutor, you can pull your pension at 55, but it's only 20% of what your salary was if you only had 10
Right.
years in. So, I did the math and like, if I made it, I won't get into specific numbers, but like I did the math where it was like, if I could make within the first 2 years X amount and save and invest that, plus I had amount of money in the pension that I had to take out because if you don't vest, you can't leave it in there. So
Correct.
like combining those two things, I was like, well, even at like 5% a year, which is like 2% less than the average, I'm going to be about the same, but I'm going to own the principal as my own instead of like when you die, it's like, well,
Right.
if you didn't get all the money back from what you put into the pension, like the state won, thank you. So,
Yes.
it just didn't make, to me, it didn't make sense to do it because even the money that was going to sit in the pension was going to sit there for 20 years, not grow at all, and I was going to pull like, you know, 20% of my salary, which wasn't that much, and I was going to pay taxes on it too. So,
Yeah.
yeah. So that's ultimately I was like,
So it's like it was time. You did what people should do when they're thinking about life decisions. I mean, you also got to think about like, if you're if being a prosecutor is kind of getting old, not saying you weren't enjoying it, but you were kind of like going through the motions, like you said, like 3 years is a long time. It's not a long time, but when you're not fully.
yeah, it was just time. I felt it was time.
Yeah, so you said something interesting to me because I always used to hear in law school, like I could never be a criminal defense attorney. And like I would hear that constantly. And like you said you were comfortable with it. Can you talk about like why you're comfortable with it and why you think it's important? Because it's a really good, like when people say that, like I get what they mean, but like if we didn't have criminal defense attorneys, we'd be like in trouble.
You know, I think the best way to answer this is just from the practical human side. Prosecutors are people, defense attorneys are people, and the defendants are people. And all those people have stories. The defendants have stories, how did they get to where they got to? Sometimes their stories are not very compelling, and you kind of sit there and think like, well, like maybe you should have just not made choice X, Y, and Z. And that's true. And sometimes they are sort of compelling, and you sit there and you go, wow, you know what? I don't know where I would be if I had to walk through those shoes. But more than that, and where I think that to me, doing either or is fine, is that I've seen the human side of the prosecutor's office and I've seen the human side of the defense side. And, everybody has a different view on morality. They all have a different view on how to prosecute, like how to defend the case. And on the defense side, when I was a prosecutor, I would see some really good attorneys that did their job, and I would see a lot more, in my opinion, that would just half-ass it. And
Right.
they'd show up, they would do like the bare minimum that would be required to just like kind of like pass off as being their attorney. And a lot of times with these criminal cases, especially where someone's stuck in jail, is what happens is that they get so many credits towards the whatever sentence they might get that the state will just like sell off the case at some low number because they know that the person's already done the time and they're going to get paroled soon. So a lot of attorneys, like, they'll kind of just show up to court and, they'll go up and be like, hey, what's the offer? It's like, well, it hasn't changed since the last time we were here. Like, all right, well,
Right.
we'll just push it out 6 months or whatever, 3 months. So that was one side of things. And it annoyed the shit out of me because I'd be like, sometimes I'd be sitting there and be like, man, like, there were times when I was a prosecutor where I agreed with the defense, and it might have been my case or it might have not been my case, and I might have just been watching at that moment. But I would be like, man, I wish that I could stand over there for like 10 minutes and just like,
Right.
like hash out what needs to be hashed out and probably
Right.
win. And then just go back over to the other side. But that was the one part of it. And then the other part of it is that, when I was a prosecutor, there was always this like push and pull of, oh, we got to be, try to be fair, be just. And to me, that's the most important part. Yeah. You, like, as a prosecutor, like, you're basically sitting there, like, you got to you're trying to do justice. At the same time, there's this, the internal office push and pull of like, well, I think pleading this case out to X is fair. But if I plead the case out to X, I'm not going to get any like attention in the office. Like, no one's going to say like, "Good job, but you pled that case out. Like, that was excellent work."
Yeah.
So there's always this. I'm full of like, oh, you got to try a case because you got to like get experience, and like I've seen it where like maybe a case should be a 3-year offer, but it's a 5-year offer because the prosecutor wants to try the case, or
Right.
and I it wasn't just that, the people you talked about who say they can't, I can never be a prosecutor, I can never be a defense attorney. I call them true believers. They're the true believers.
Right.
And we used to make fun when I was in the prosecutor's office. We would be like, there are some defense attorneys who'd be like, oh, that guy's he's a true believer, and they would be the ones who would come in and they would go hard. And honestly, they did a lot. They did good work. Sometimes they'd get so overly zealous that they would kind of just lose sight of like the
Right.
most important things in the case that they should go after. But they at least gave a shit and they cared, and they would like, sometimes they're a little over the top because they get real personal in the way they would advocate. Like, they'd bring up your personal, like, wow, look, you should come down because like, you're XYZ. And it's like, listen, like, this isn't about me. Like, let's stick to the case.
Right.
What I would say, and I didn't really have to deal with it when I was a prosecutor, but there are true believers on the prosecutor side too. And to me, like, dealing with the true believers on the prosecutor side, I think it is a bit worse than dealing with the true believers on the defense side, because people on the prosecutor side have like actual power and authority.
Right.
And so, there's just there's been times where I would be like to myself, like, if I was the prosecutor in this case, it would be an easy resolution. Like, this would be the resolution X. X is an easy one. It's an easy resolution. It makes sense. It's fair. Like, in my experience, I've seen it done 1,000 times. And then you run into a prosecutor who just doesn't like feel the same way. And I'm not sitting here saying they're wrong, but at the same time, that's why I can do both sides, because to me, I have an idea in my head of what's fair and where we're shooting to go. And I mean, I'm good at talking to my clients and explaining things to them. And I'm like, pretty often, if X is what's being offered, I'm able to explain to them why X is the right way to go. And so, to me, like, I can do both sides because it's not about prosecuting or defending. It's about reaching that resolution that's fair for everyone.
Right.
And sometimes that's not what the client wants to do, and that's fine.
Right.
That's their choice, right? They want to go to trial. And then you got to go to trial and you got to do what you got to do, right? But a lot of times you go to trial because you haven't reached X.
Yeah.
Like, that's the long and short of it for me. That I don't really. It's if you didn't have defense attorneys, like, people, like, if the everyday people, if they heard some of the things that happen in criminal court, like, against the defendant, they wouldn't really be like thrilled by it. Like,
Yeah, I think that I agree with you. It is already, very stacked against the person, the defendant, and I think people don't think about it. And also, like you said, there's just a lot of incentives for it. Prosecutors to, not that they're not playing by the rules, but not to keep the most maybe fair outcome in mind. And like you said, take something to trial because it makes them look good or there's pressure in the office. And
Yeah, and the other thing of it too is there's a lot of like look, we have our criminal code, right? And it has
uh,
all the different charges and all the different sentencing ranges. The criminal code, though, it's not meant to be enforced as like a rigid, like we're just like, oh, if it fits, we prosecute it, and this is the range of the sentence, so we got to go for it. I mean, I'll give you an example. They just changed the law on burglary not that long ago, where if you break into a residence and you commit a burglary in a residence, it's a first degree crime, and it's 10 to 20 years at 85%. Now, before they changed the law, that would be a third degree crime, and it was 3 to 5 years with no mandatory parole and eligibility. So they
same
left
crime.
they left it from that to the most serious range you could possibly have. And I'm not here to debate whether they should have done that. I mean, you know, I do understand the argument that, residential burglaries are a little different and they should be treated more seriously. I understand that. But here's the problem. It's such a broad statute that, you could have a case, and I've seen this several times now, where someone goes over to someone's house because there's a domestic dispute. They're standing at the doorway, arguing with their neighbor or something at the door, and then someone throws a punch, and the threshold of the doorway is broken.
Yeah, well,
And now you go from a misdemeanor assault to a first degree home invasion burglary, 10 to 20 years, 85%. That person has no record. That person may get detained pending trial. That person may be offered a state prison sentence, and so and I've seen it, and it depends on what county you're in. Like, if you're in a county that doesn't have a lot of cases, well, guess what? You're the most serious case on the docket right now, and you're probably going to have to either go to trial or have to like plead to a prison sentence, right? If you're in a more crowded county where they have a lot of cases and there's more prosecutors with more experience, where they're like, hey, this isn't really what the legislature meant to like charge
right,
this,
right.
like
Like
it
this,
wasn't like they
it
passed
wasn't
this.
to get this guy,
Yeah,
but
they
this
didn't
one.
pass this bill for like the guy that like throws a punch through the doorway of a house like
Yes,
to get 10 20. Like that's not what it's for. And they might amend it and come down. Like, to me, if I was prosecuting that case, unless there was some serious injury dealt to the
right, right,
victim, I would consult with the victim. I explain everything I just told you, and I would tell him, like, in my mind, like, I think it'd be unfair to send this person to prison who has no record over this like dispute that happened. Like, but we're not going to dismiss the case. We're going to do X, Y, and Z.
right.
And usually, 99% of the time when I had that conversation with the victim on that case or some other different case, they understood. And I would always try to accommodate their wishes as best I could. That case could have some in custody involved. We could have a county jail sentence of some sort, but
Right.
10, 20, like a real state prison sentence at 85%. Yeah, I don't think that's justified. But
Right.
here's where I come back to. There are prosecutors who will sit there and be like, well, that's what the law is. That's what
Right.
it
Right.
says. Like they'd be like, here, let me get my law book out, and they'd say, yeah, well, it meets the elements. He broke the
Right.
threshold and he committed a
Right. Right.
crime there and he hit him, right? So
Right.
what do you mean? Like, it's 10, 20 years. And they'll offer 10 years. They're like, what's his first offense? He could get the bottom of the range. So like and to
Right.
me, like, that's like, those are like the true believers on the other side,
Correct. Correct.
and as a defense attorney, like, you don't have any like powers invested in you from the state of New Jersey. Like, you go in there and you have, things you can challenge and arguments you can make, but at the end of the day, it's the prosecutor who gets to decide what charge to put in there or what offer to make.
Yeah, there's a lot of out of your control, and I think the example you gave is so important because, and I love the word true believer because we knew I knew people like that in law school who were like, well, technically, like that
Those
was
are the
their.
ones who end up, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that was like their argument. Well, technically, but like there are in the and like when you're in law school and younger, you listen to those arguments and they sound kind of okay. That's reasonable because it's all theory. But then when you see like it's real people and real lives, it's probably different.
And I think, look, when you're a prosecutor, you don't interact with defendants. Like I can. There was one instance. There was one instance where the defense attorney said, "Come in here and talk to my client because he doesn't understand." And I'm like, I don't think I should do this, but I'll do it anyway. So I went in there and like with him there, I spoke to the guy, and that's one of the only times I got to interact with a defendant like that, like in my 7 years. But I would see it, like I would observe it. I was close friends with a lot of the public defenders that worked, and one that I worked with directly. We're friends to this day, and we would have a lot of like detailed conversations about where the client was at and what his backstory and different things like that. But as a prosecutor, you really don't see the human side of it. And someone's gonna say, "Oh, damn, lose a true believer now." But the reality is, to me, like you don't have to be a true believer to be like, all right, well, like this guy, like he's 30 something years old, he has XYZ offenses, like he didn't get here overnight. Like how did he get here? And I think it does play into whether or not someone's going to reoffend down the road, like how they got to that point,
Right.
and like what chances they have gotten before, and who they are, like what their story is, like if I have a sentencing that's contested and I have to like litigate and advocate for a sentence that's not like clear as far as what the court's going to do, like I always make sure, like I get character letters from the family, I talk to the client, I tell his story, like like, hey, this is so and so. He's 30 years old. He was born here. He grew up here. He went to school here. He did all these different things. Like this is how he ended up in this position on this day, and how this is the journey that brought him there. And you don't really deal with that as a prosecutor. And honestly, there's not enough defense attorneys that I think take the time to tell the story, as far as especially at sentencing. So that again, it does come, and some of the prosecutors, they do care. Like I cared as a prosecutor. I wanted to hear the other side. Like I wanted to try to be fair. Some prosecutors,
Yes.
send them a letter, outline it,
Just
and they're just like, yeah, I don't care. Yeah, that's
check in the box,
like cool, like yeah, like checking the
they-
box. Like honestly, that's to me, and it comes from sometimes it comes from the court too. You'll see it from the
right.
court side. Some judges, they'll really like think about what they want to do, and they'll read what you wrote, and they'll read the prosecutor wrote, and they'll hear your arguments, and they'll come to a decision like based off of a review of all that. And then there are others who, in my view and from what I've seen, there are others who, they, as soon as the plea goes through and it's for X number, they're like, I don't care what anyone
Probably
says.
don't. They
I'm
probably
gonna give that number. I'm giving that number. I don't
yeah.
give a shit. Like, and like you said, it's checking boxes. Like on to the next defendant. I wouldn't say that the courts are generally fair to the defendants, but there is a level of just like passive indifference at times, where it's just like you've done something so long that like you just become like somewhat jaded to
Right.
the same arguments or the same shit coming up. And I've seen it. So I forget what your original question was.
No, but what you said is, I don't even remember, but what you said, I think is really true of like, just the way, the system works in reality and people are trying their best, but there's also just a human factor of, after 8 years, after 10 years being a prosecutor, you get jaded. Like that's what happens. Same thing on the defense attorney, same thing as a judge. Like things having you kind of go through the motions. I got another question for you because I think what you said is true too. Like, I think a lot of people think that, well, if you're in the criminal justice system, you should just have made better choices. And okay, yes, usually,
No, that's not an incorrect statement.
but yes,
Definitely,
yes, usually.
there's a 100% a level of like
I always
choices
tell,
that get made.
I always tell people that I'm working with in the nonprofit world, like never give up your power to make better choices. But I will say, in that defense too, like your capacity for choices and like it's based on kind of who you are and what resources you have and what support you have. Like your idea of what is a good choice can go into a bunch of factors. So just talk about like, because that's what I want to get to. I've worked with some people with disabilities who are dealing with being in the court system, and I have felt that, if they didn't have a disability, if they didn't have a disability, they might have gotten a better circumstances. Not completely, not that they would, but that being able to present yourself or not lose your cool or like you said, understand what even they're being told. Like all those factors, I think, come into play, even if everybody, in the criminal justice system has the best intentions. So I just wanted to talk about this. Like there's sometimes factors
Yeah,
people's
so
control.
I mean, I will say that generally, like, let me break it down like this. Okay, the word, like, someone has a disability. I mean, that obviously is a very broad statement, and it can apply to
Right.
a lot of different
It
things.
applies to a lot of people.
So the most like we'll start off like up here, and we'll come
Right.
down lower. I mean, the most serious situations where you have, let's say, a mental health diagnosis, like this
Right.
person has schizophrenia, right?
Right.
The things that are in place under the law to address those situations are very short. There's a lot of shortcomings there. And they have just started what's called a mental health court diversion program, which I'll talk about in a minute, but it's still in its early days. It's not in every county. I think ultimately it will hopefully sort of address some of the shortfalls that I'm going to mention. But essentially, though, you got somebody who's got schizophrenia. He committed the crime because he thought he'll say he assaulted someone because he thought that person was the devil or something like that, or
Right.
the voices told him that this person was evil and he had to attack him. Okay, that is going to be like potentially a not guilty by reason of insanity plea. Now that doesn't happen very often because it's a very high standard.
Yeah. People
And
don't understand that.
like and also too, in order to get to it, you have to get an expert. The other problem with it is you can't just plead someone not guilty by reason of insanity without them being like on board. So you basically you have someone with mental illness who has to agree to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. As you can imagine, sometimes that's difficult, convincing them to do that. But one step even farther removed is someone who is incompetent, meaning that their mental illness didn't just apply to the crime; it applies at the time that their case is in front of the court, and their mental illness disables them so much that they can't even understand what's happening, and that they're part of the criminal justice process, and what my role is, what the prosecutor's role is, and what the court's role is. Those are people who are incompetent, and they get sent. What happens with them is that you got to ask for a competency evaluation, and that process can take 6 to 12 months. So a lot of times, sometimes I've had like lower level cases where I know that this is going to resolve to like probation or something like that. But if I ask for a competency evaluation, this guy is going to be in for like 6 to 12 months. He's going to be sitting between jail and Ancora waiting for this evaluation to be done. So, that I had a guy where I had that situation, and like I could tell if I asked for, I could tell that like he probably was incompetent, but he had enough lucid moments where I was like, okay, like let's see if we could just get this done, because ultimately he was in the jail. If we didn't get it done, and I did the competency route, he was going to be in for like 6 to 12 months. He's going to be
Right.
So I ultimately like was able to resolve it, got him on probation. Hope for the best, because like at that point I'm not part of the process anymore. We got him on a special mental health caseload where it's a probation officer that deals with people with mental health issues. Again, great that they did that, but it really wasn't enough to address like someone like him, who kind of just after he got out wandered off into the sunset. And then ultimately he picked up a new case. He got charged again, and that time around, I said, all right, I have to just ask for the competency evaluation. So that time around, I did do that, and it did. It took 6 to 12 months. The guy would call me, like, what's happening with the case? I'd try to explain it to him, and he would be like, you're a piece of shit. Like, you don't do anything for me. Like, fuck you.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I'm like, oh man, like I hate this. Like but I had to keep telling him, like, look, I know and I would follow up with them. So maybe I shaved off a few months of them, like, dragging their ass on it. But ultimately we got it back. And after he went to Ancora and they medicated him a bit, he did regain his competency and he was able to participate in the case. And at that point, we were able to resolve the case. And we resolved it to, like, I forget what we did, but we basically, like, just, he did enough time where we just cut him loose. Like, he was just done. And hopefully, I haven't heard from him since then, so hopefully everything worked out for him. But that's the first layer, is the competency issue. If you're not competent, if ultimately they say we can't get this person to regain competency, and it's usually with people with, like, developmental disabilities, like people who you can't just, like, give a medicine and, like, fix them.
Correct. I want people to understand that too. It's like a high bar. I can't just go in and say I have cerebral palsy, therefore.
They'd
be like, "Is that you in the picture of the law school photo?" Like,
Yeah. So
I think I know what's going on. So, like, people need to understand that. But, like, I'm just talking, and that was a great explanation. Like, it does play, it is a factor, even if you are competent, I think a lot of times.
Yeah, so if you are competent,
right,
then you come back to court. Now, that guy, I probably could have pled him not, like, guilty by reason of insanity. He probably could have gone down that road. But that, being found not guilty by reason of insanity, means you're going to be on, like, a supervisory status for up to the maximum sentence you could get. So in his case, I think it was like 5 to 10 years. He would be on this supervision status where he might even be stuck in Ancora during a big chunk of that time. So you don't make that plea lightly. Like, it's not something you do unless it's a really serious case and you actually have an argument. So I've only seen it happen a handful of times my entire career. So those are the two coded ways of dealing with mental illness, right? But then what about everybody else? Like, what if you don't meet the standard of not guilty by reason of insanity? And where that, at least until recently when they started this mental health court, really the only real thing that came up in was negotiations with the prosecutor. It'd be like, you would put together a mitigation packet. You would get, like, if someone had a diagnosis, you'd get documentation of it. You'd get letters from family members. You send them to the prosecutor. You say, hey, can you please, with sugar on top, like, give this guy probation? He doesn't, he's got this illness. He needs to be addressed. And probation they had special people who would handle mental health load, and they would try to get them into treatment. But a lot of times they end up back in court because it wasn't structured enough to keep track of them all and to keep them on in line. As far as your, like, question about how does mental health impact, like, are you asking, like,
I was like my question would be like the mental health court, do you think that's better? Has that proven more successful of addressing these issues? Because, like, I understand, and I always tell people I work with this who are involved in the court system, like, it's a system. You're not, like, their level of sympathy for you is limited to, like, what they're trying to do here. Like, it's not the same as going to Donald's nonprofit where it's like, yeah, we're all here to help and, like, all that stuff. But I just want to, like, now that there's a mental health court, has that been an appropriate avenue to kind of maybe address things that weren't getting addressed?
I'd say it is still early and young as a program. It's not in every county, and I've had limited experience dealing with it directly. I've had, like, 2 cases go into the program. I will say I think they do. There's a level of tolerance that you need to have in these types of programs, especially dealing with people with mental illness, where they might go in and screw up, and
Correct.
The traditional mentality would be like, well, screw you. We gave you a second chance. Like, now you're going to prison, And, like, I get it. I mean, I grew up in a Christian family. Like, that's what, like, we would say. Like,
I do too.
But their mentality, I think, has shifted, at least from the court's training and perspective. Like their mentality has shifted like, well, you do have to do that eventually, but you know, you need to give them a few chances first, because like you got to try to see if you can like they fall and you like prop them back up, like all right, like try again,
Right.
fall, and then eventually you have to cut them loose at some point. But I did have a client got into mental health court, and once they get into the mental health court, like I'm like my representation is really done, and there's a public defender that represents everyone that goes through that court process, like there, which is basically like you know you have to go every like week or every other week. It's like you check in, they ask you how you doing and make sure that you're going to
Right.
treatment and everything. But I had that one client. As soon as she went in, she went to an inpatient and she left the facility, and they had a
Right.
bench warrant out for her. They
Yep.
arrested her. And I thought, like I said to the guy who does I was like, is she done for? And he's like, no, they'll probably give her a chance. So ultimately, she did get back in, which didn't kick her out. They took her into custody. Like she was in jail for a little bit, and then they put her back in another program, gave her a second chance. And I saw her. I was at the courthouse the other day, and then I actually saw her like sitting in the outside the courtroom. It was like a check-in day, and she said hi to me, and she told me she was doing well now. So hopefully it worked out. Now, will she screw up again? Like I don't know. And but in her case, it's got to be a case by case basis.
Right.
In her case, I won't get into the details of her case. But in her situation, it wasn't a lot of skin off anyone's back to give her a second chance. You know what I mean? Like
Yes.
like there wasn't anyone shouting from the other side saying like, she should be in prison or anything like that.
Right. There wasn't like a big victim family probably being
Right.
like, look.
And that's a huge part. Like victim input is a huge part of what the prosecutor does. And, I would
Which is
always
understandable.
Yeah, no, I mean it is. I mean that's they're not representing the victims directly, but their interests are part of what
Right.
drives
It's
the prosecution. So if you have a case where everybody's like this person needs to go into treatment, and the victims are like, yeah, he should go into treatment, it's a lot easier to do it that way. Versus you have a case where the victim, for whatever the type of case is, where the victim says, like, screw this guy, he should go to prison. It's different. Like it doesn't mean they won't get into a diversion, but it makes it more difficult. Like if there was like if them going into diversion based on those charges was like unlikely, the victim saying I don't want him to go in is pretty much a death sentence on that. Like like you're not gonna get in normally,
right.
unless it's unless it's like we can't justify objecting to this person going in. So yeah, the victim input is a huge part.
That's crucial.
But I mean say too, like, representing, now doing this for 2 years, representing people, like we started off here, like, diagnosed mental illness, severe, needs to be medicated, developmental disabilities where like they have the cognitive functioning of like a child, or something. I've seen that plenty, and those are the people that usually get found incompetent and not likely to regain competency. I mean, I had, for example, and this is another shortfall in our system, is like what happens to these people, but I had a case. It involved a sexual assault of a minor. It was a family member who had developmental disabilities, and this was when I was a prosecutor. And ultimately, the guy was found incompetent by 3 separate experts. And I had to tell the family, I was like, listen, I'm sorry. Like, nothing I can do at this point. Like, we hired our own expert, the court had an expert, and the defense has an expert. And all 3 of them say that this person is incompetent. And ultimately, the case was dismissed, because that's what happens when someone is incompetent and unlikely to regain competency. The criminal case is dismissed, and then there's separate things that will determine whether there needs to be like a civil commitment kind of thing going on. But in this particular case, they determined that they couldn't civilly commit him, which wasn't like, that was outside of my position. Like there was that's the attorney general's office handles some situations, and then the county adjuster handles other situations, and they both found that there was no grounds to civilly commit. So like that's another thing. It's like, well, this person, he probably should never be around a kid, in any setting, but there's now nothing really in place to
Right. You
force that.
you still have to like justify, even though probably this person should not be around the kid. Like you said, there needs to be a legal basis.
Right, like and I won't get into the specifics of why there wasn't, but in that particular, it's not easy. It's not easy
No.
to civilly commit someone. And sometimes you would think like, oh, this is no, it's not, because there's a certain standard that has to be met. But anyway, the people who then going down the chain, like people who don't have, they might have some sort of disability. Maybe they had a learning disability, and
Right.
they're just a little bit slow to
Process, yeah.
or process risk, right? Like these are the people who you'll see the most in the criminal justice process, because ultimately every criminal case originates from some shitty decision that
some bad decision.
right? And there is personal responsibility, no doubt.
Right.
In my experience, the people who find themselves in those situations, they tend to just not be able to wrap their head around, like, this is not a great choice, or this is like a risky choice. And they make these bad decisions. They put themselves in shitty situations that ultimately lead to them being criminally charged. I mean, one example would be getting into a car with somebody who's got a bag of drugs. Well, you know what? It's not my bag, right? That's not my bag of drugs. That's my friend's bag of drugs.
Yeah.
Just getting a ride.
I'm just in the car.
What's the big deal? Well, guess what? Like, car gets pulled over.
Yeah.
One thing leads to the next. All of a sudden, they're searching the car, and we can talk for a whole hour about, when they can and can't search the car. But let's assume they can. They search the car. They find the bag of drugs in the center console. Who's getting arrested for the bag of drugs?
Right. Exactly.
Everyone in the car is getting arrested.
Everyone in the car. They're not saying whose drugs in these
They might.
Yeah.
I mean, they might be like, whose is this? Everybody just says nothing, right? And now it's like, well, there's probable cause to arrest all of you. Whether the case will actually lead to a conviction is of no moment for that person in that time, because he's now going to get arrested. And if he has any record, or it's a serious amount of drugs, or maybe they found a gun, God forbid, they found a gun. No one even knew it was there except the person who owned it. And now that everybody's getting charged with guns and drugs, and the state's going to probably try to file to detain the person pending the outcome. So, and that, like, there's plenty of people I've seen get detained for, like, things found inside of a vehicle that were not theirs, but no one took ownership of them. And from the state's perspective, they don't know whose it belongs to. And so if it's in an innocuous location in the car, everybody gets charged, right? So, like, that's just, and that's one poor decision, right? Just the people you spend time around.
Yes.
And then, the one I mentioned before about the example of the home invasion, where you go to argue with someone at the door threshold, and you throw a punch. It's like, well, like, the person who threw the punch through the door, or threshold of the door, they didn't contemplate that they were about to commit a first-degree crime, 10 to 20 years, 85.
Right. They didn't know that they changed the statute.
And that's not to say that if they hadn't changed it, that it was okay to do that.
Right. No, I'm not saying that either.
But like, it's just it's like in my experience, like, a lot of clients, they just don't. There might be something in the moment that maybe from a non like legal perspective, like, justifies, like, what they're doing. Like maybe the person they punched
deserved it.
Them in the right. Maybe they objectively deserve it, right? But, like, legally, like, there's no justification for it. And so, like, in that moment, they'll throw that punch because this person has done X, Y, and Z, has maybe abused them in the past, or done something to them in the past that was never prosecuted. Who knows? But now, in that moment, they're on a ring camera, at the door, punch through the door, and so they don't take the time to think about, like, what happens, like, if I do this, what are the long-term
What
repercussions?
happens after the punch if this gets serious?
Yes.
And once
And I think that there is a level, if we're talking about disability, in terms of learning disabilities, in terms of just
process,
like people who just aren't on the same level as someone the same age as them, but maybe like we'll get there eventually. Like
right,
not that there's anything like permanent, but how do you even, those are situations where you can't really like. Sometimes you can have conversations with the prosecutor and be like, "Look, this kid, like, you get what you can get. I mean, if there's an
right,
IEP or something, or if there's like some
right,
documentation of this person's like, you know, um, path through life as far as like going to school and stuff like that, you try to mark that out. But a lot of times, like, these are things you can't really like aggregate. You can't like
right,
document it. It's just But as a defense attorney talking to them, you can tell that they have like
right.
just a cognitive gap there as far as grasping. Because even like I've had clients where I'm trying to explain to them like some basic principle, and I would say like I'm pretty good at explaining things, like even complicated things to people who like might not be able to like understand them easily. And there are some clients, a handful at least, where I could just tell like there's something going on there. It's not diagnosed. It's like it's not necessarily
Hmm.
like
I know
something
exactly
I
what you're
can,
talking about.
but those are the one. I would say that's the biggest area where there's not a ton that can be done. Even the mental health court requires a diagnosis. You need a diagnosis in order to get in the mental health court. So the people who kind of like go through life without like obtaining services as a kid, or
Right. Which
they
happens.
they become an adult, and they clearly have gaps in their education, or in like they're behind in just developing like risk assessment, or just critical thinking, and there's not a lot you can do for those people in terms of like trying to impact the outcome based on that, because there's not documented. There's nothing to really
Right.
point to.
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly. And
so
that's what like I always say, like, because people know in my center, that's what we do. We're helping people get resources and get documentation. But like when you're in a court system, it's like they're not like, quick, let's fill out this DDD application. And like it's not like, it's you guys have a different job to do, and it's understandable. And that's why what you said is it's important for people the best they can really think about you know, those consequences. And I know, like, I know it's easier said than done because sometimes you're limited
yeah,
on the friends you have, and it's easy for people to say, oh, don't hang out with certain people. Well, if that's your neighborhood and your family and your support, like, it's like
yeah, no,
difficult, but like, you got to think
yeah.
about, like, okay, if I punch somebody, like, even if I got away with punching somebody 7 times before,
That's the
it
other
only
thing. Like,
takes
who
the
knows
eighth
how
time.
often that's happened? Like you have those situations where the punch through the doorway. I keep coming back to that because it's just there's such a gap
Yeah,
between like what it is and like what the punishment potentially is.
right,
But like you don't know too, like how many times did it happen the other way around? Like how
correct.
many times did it like like this is there's some ongoing like dispute between these two people where if you were like God and you could see that what happened at all times and have a full accounting of everything, you'd probably be like, you know what? Yeah, he probably deserved a punch in the face.
Right, exactly.
Like yeah,
Exactly. He
he
should have
probably
been
deserved a punch
punched.
in the face. But guess what? The law doesn't care. Like the law
No,
doesn't
they
even
don't.
know. Like the law is not gonna like look at like, well, what like they're not gonna like Hatfield and McCoy
Right,
like,
right,
well, whose sheep was it? Like,
right.
like
In
or whatever it was.
2007, in
Right, right. So,
2007, in 2017, he got
so
punched, and like they don't care.
and that's the thing too, is like sometimes you just gotta let shit go. And it's
Right.
I think harder for certain people to let shit go and to see the big picture.
Well,
Like,
that's a great point because when I'm working with people who are going through stuff, and and maybe entering the court system, I try to have like I try to prep them a little bit. Not that I do law and stuff, but I try to say you got to take the emotion out of it and like
Yeah,
talk
and
to
that
your.
I mean that's
And
a
it's
huge.
hard for people. People get invested. If people like even like people sit there and they go, "But I did nothing wrong," or "I was justified in punching that person." Like in the court, that doesn't really look at
Right.
the
It
evidence.
doesn't matter if they were justified
You're
like
right.
morally, like it makes no difference. But the but but yeah, there is a level of two. It's like XYZ, and you're like, well, XYZ doesn't matter in this
Right.
case. Like it's not even potentially not even going to come up at trial. Like,
Correct.
and so, that's a big part is being you got like for I think a lot of we're like circling back to the learning disabilities and the other issues that might come up in someone's life that are not documented. There's a level of like the poor choices start off with putting yourself around people you shouldn't, putting
Right.
yourself in a place that you probably shouldn't be, but also like fixating on things that don't matter.
It don't matter.
Like I mean, there's
Exactly.
so many like Atlantic City. There's so many gang shootings in Atlantic City, and most of the shootings in Atlantic County originate from some sort of gang dispute in Atlantic City or some sort of like issue between two people who just have beef. Like they have beef, right? And
Right.
and it's like the beef could be over like a girl. It could be over like just stupid shit. And especially these younger kids, like 18, 19 years old, like they think that being the hot shot person in their
Right.
circle of friends who realistically is probably a gang, like depending on the situation, but like I've seen it too often where it's like so and so is walking down the street, driving a car, and he sees so and so that he has a beef with, and it's like, oh shit, like it's the ops, like the other gang, like,
Yeah.
and it's like we talk about gangs in Atlantic City, like realistically, it's like, well, you're in this gang because you live over here,
Correct. Correct.
and you're in this gang because
That
you live
makes
over here, and it's like you're both live in Atlantic City, but growing up in those two different areas, like they become
creates a
adversaries.
dynamic.
So and then it evolves past that too. There's disputes in school, disputes over girls, disputes over other things, and then that rivalry continues, and then you end up with this spontaneous decision of like that's so and so, he's in the ops, shoot a few bullets out the window, right? And it's like, well, you just fired a fucking gun in public. There's
Right.
so many horrible things that can happen, like other than actually even just hitting that person you're shooting at, which is also
Correct.
horrible. That shooting that
Could
happened
hit
in
anybody.
Pleasantville several years ago, where it was one guy beefing with another guy, and they shot into the bleachers at that football game, and they killed that kid. And it's like now that guy, I think he got life. And it's like, was it worth it?
Right. Right.
like,
That's
like in that moment, was there nothing that said to you like maybe this isn't a good idea? So yeah, like I think that there is a layer of like disability might be a strong word to describe it, but there's a layer of like just disconnect from like we would anticipate a regular person deciding to do.
well, and like you said, I just think like to the extent you can, always asking yourself before you do something like, is this worth it? Because you don't have
Yeah,
control of things. Like you get into a fight in a situation, like even if you're just like, you punch somebody, it could be nothing. They could fall on the ground. They fall on the ground, and they die. That's like a big
yeah,
deal. Like that's
yeah. I
like a
mean,
big deal.
it's yeah, right. Like there's that risk that you throw a punch. Like forget about the door threshold of the door. I mean, you could see
Yeah.
that at a barbecue, like with your friends, and like so your friend pisses you off, and like you get into an argument and you want to punch him in the face. I mean, I've seen cases, one punch him in the face, falls back, hits his head on something, dead. Or punch him in
Correct.
punch. I mean, there was just a case in Hamilton a couple of months ago. There was a dispute between two people, argument, punch. Did walked away. They walked away from each other. 2 days later, guy dies because he had some sort of aneurysm from the punch. And now that other person's charged with homicide, and it's like,
Correct.
Like there are day-to-day decisions, even ones that maybe some people would be like, oh, well, that's like whatever,
Right.
but like like doing what I do, I see the risk. I see the
I know.
long-term risk in a lot of things that, like, even just like someone cuts you off and you flip them off. Like, I'm like, I'm not doing that. That's the
Oh,
start. That's the start of like 10% of my cases that involve a car. Like somebody gets into an argument like while they're driving, and then someone road rage does some crazy shit and threatens the life of you. Like, you got cut off, right? And you
yeah.
flip the person off, and then all of a sudden, like, that guy is like brake checking you or doing some
Right.
crazy
Now we're
shit.
escalating. Now
Right.
we're
And it's
escalating.
like, as much, it's like not worth it. Don't flip them off. Just let it go. You'll never see that
Right.
person again in your life. Let him drive away, and like, he'll get his one day, probably, if he keeps doing that kind of shit. He'll end up
Correct.
crashing his own car, and hopefully he doesn't kill anyone else.
I am always the person in the car who tells people what you just said. And I am always, and they're like, don't shut up. Like, they'll be like, don't shut up. I'm like,
Yeah,
no,
but
you don't know. That guy could, you don't even know what that guy has in the car. You have,
right, and I've seen cases. I've seen cases where somebody starts off in the right and then they end up in the wrong, and in the wrong in a way that, like, they're like way more in it than the other person is.
even
Like,
if you are right and can prove it all legally, you would, like, let's say you have a situation, somebody flips you off, something happens, then they get out of the car and do something horrible. Like, they're not going to come to court and go, I did something horrible. They're going to
yeah,
say he started it.
right.
Now you're in a
But
situation where you have to get someone.
my colleague had a case where somebody cut off someone, and they like threw coins at their car, right? And so that person is the victim of that situation, right? So he follows the person
Yeah.
that did this to him
Horrible idea.
to his house.
Terrible
To
idea.
Terrible idea, to, like, I guess, get confront him about it. Well, this guy's kids come out the house. They start beating the shit out of him. He has to get back in his car, and, like, as he's trying to leave because they're kind of blocking him in, he ends up running over the other guy.
Oh
And
my
so,
God.
and then he gets charged with aggravated assault, and he ends up in the jail, and they have to, like, he ends up getting released, but, like, the state tried to detain him, and he almost got detained. And if you get detained, like, you're going to be sitting for quite a while, like,
Right.
for
Now
that.
you're in a
And
situation.
it's like, all of this could have been avoided if you just didn't.
It was over coins over a car, which really, in the scheme of life, doesn't matter. But so I just think that's so true. And as we're wrapping up, because I can really talk to you like forever, like for a long time. Like I don't know about you, but I still get a lot of questions about people. Even though I don't practice, I get a lot of questions about people asking me, should I go to law school? I still get that question from people. I want to know what your thoughts are on that because I always joke
I,
like no, but I always say
I
absolutely
don't
not.
I don't
Then I go
regret
maybe. But what do you say?
going to law school. I mean, I like what I do. Like, it was a long journey to get where I'm at right now, but it's all a personal decision. Like, going to law school, you shouldn't go to law school or not go to law school because somebody else tells you
Correct.
not to.
Yes.
I mean, you have to just kind of weigh it out yourself. I mean, I'll be candid with you, Donald. Like, well, let me ask you, like, do you regret going to law school? Like,
No, I really wanted to do it. And that's what I tell people. I really wanted to do it. But I do remember, because you and I were in those classes together, like we worked hard. We worked hard in college. Like because you gotta get a good GPA and you gotta
yeah,
do well in the LSATs. Like, yeah, we had fun in college. I'm just saying, like, it is a commitment. Like some of the classes other people were taking, I would be like, I was taking. Like I got 4 papers due, and I have to do well because like I need to maintain a strong GPA. I need to at least get above a 3.0. And like
yeah.
so it's a lot of work. That's what I tell people. And then you're in law school and it's a lot of work. So just know what you're getting into.
Yeah, so I would say like that's just such a personal decision. No one can tell you whether or not to go to law school. You got to decide yourself. As far as like career is concerned, like you'll find a job. Just look around, and don't waste the 3 years that you're in law school like interning places that you don't even want to work. Like you got to intern and
Like,
get experience where you want to ultimately be, and hopefully make contacts along the way that will help you get there. Um, I will say obviously there's a factor of the loans involved and the cost. So like don't just take out six-figure loans without any plan of what you're going to do. Like
yes,
like if a college offers you money over here, but the college over here doesn't offer you anything, go to the first college.
that is
Like
first one.
you don't have to go to like a higher end law school and pay out the what.
Correct.
Um,
Yes, exactly.
because unless you want to go work in New York in a high end firm or get a federal clerkship or something like that, like no one gives a shit where you went to law school.
No,
They
nobody.
don't.
That's one thing you learn. Nobody cares. Nobody's ever been like,
Especially after you get your first job. Once you get your first job, after that, no one cares. No one cares. They don't. Like it's
right.
all about like what you've done like with your career at that point. Now, like, all right, you got to get the first job, but like believe me, like you just what you can't do is you can't meander through the 3 years without any plan and any like having done nothing to try to like set yourself up for when you get done law school. Like you have to plan ahead and try to figure out what you want to do ahead and then structure your 3 years of law school to achieving that goal. Like like you got to intern places, you got to co-op places, any credit you can possibly use to get a real life experience, you use it that way. But some of these people I know, like they didn't do anything in law school to like put themselves in
Right.
circles of people that will help them get where they want. And then they get out, I can't find a job. I can't get. There's no jobs out there. And it's like, well, you know what? Like, I don't know your personal story, but I mean, how hard did you try? Like, or like,
Yes,
what
exactly.
plan did you have? Like, did you think you were just gonna like go out of law school, like, and then just like throw your resume a bunch of places and immediately just get something? You might have to get a job that you don't want at first, just so
Right.
you
I
can
tell
like
people
get a
this.
year in, like get some experience, and then move on to what you want to do. I mean, it doesn't end at law school. Like, just understand that. You want to go to law school, like law school doesn't end when you finish law school.
I
It
tell
continues.
people, I tell people, like nobody's gonna knock on your door and be like, "I heard you graduated law school." Are you best? Like,
Right.
it's not how it works. I got my job, which is something I really enjoy doing by honestly starting out as a volunteer board member, and one thing led to another, and you network and you
Right.
meet people, and like they're like, "Oh, you have a law degree," and like no doubt the law degree got me this job. I wouldn't have got this job
Yeah.
straight out of
Yeah. Right.
college.
Yeah.
But it was that's what I tell people. Like you can't just you gotta like go to those things you don't want to go to. You gotta meet people. Like it is more about networking and of course doing well. But like you a law degree is a law degree. You have to do something with it. Value.
Yeah.
And what would you tell people? Because I get this question too. I get like, well, I did well in college. Like, how is it? How would you tell? How would you explain to people how law school is different than
I
college?
found law school to be easier than college because like
I could see you saying that.
there were no like in college like you'd have 10 different assignments to do spread out through all your classes. Law school there is no assignments. You gotta do the readings. I never read anything in law school.
Sounds like you.
I would just kind of and then there would be some people in law school, they would have like five different color highlighters and they'd be
Right.
highlighting all that, and I was like, what are you doing? The whole book is a rainbow now. Like what are you
Yes.
doing?
Yes.
Like, I mean, I'm not saying that you shouldn't read anything. I mean, honestly, I'm not saying I never.
Right. Don't do what Lewis did, everybody.
I,
Don't do what Lewis did.
I,
Lewis is really smart. I went to school with him.
I like I did read, like I just didn't read like everything that like all the time, but you know, at the end of the day, like 90% of your grade in law school is the final exam. So
Yes.
like if you take good notes, you one thing I did do all the time, I took good notes in class. Like 100% you have to take good notes. If you don't take good notes, you'll be teaching yourself the law essentially from a book in the last 2 weeks as you study for exams. You got to take good notes.
Right.
If there's anything like you got to take good notes. But there's no there's no assignments. Like it's not like college where like you're doing papers or essay. Well, the legal writing class you'll do a brief, but beyond that, I mean, like any particular class is really just a final exam. And so and there's readings, like they'll say read these 20 pages for the next class. I would usually go and like kind of just skim through it a little bit, like so that if I got called on in class, I could answer a question. But like, everyone's different. Some people need to read the whole thing, and
and
that's fine.
that's the other thing I would tell people too. Like it took me a while to adjust. Once I adjusted, I was fine. But like adjusting from that college where you kind of have like there's a little wiggle room because there's more assignments. So if you don't do well on one test, you can like do better on the next test. In law school, there's less of a room for error because it's
Right. Yeah. I mean, you got it. You got one exam,
so
so
you
you
got to figure
you
it
got to
out.
study for it.
And like nobody, and there's less like hand holding. Like in college, if you're struggling, you can go to the professor and be like, "I'm kind of struggling." And not to say
Yeah.
that you can't go to do that in law school, and there are great professors in law school, but like the final exam is the final exam. So you got to figure out how you process information the best,
Yeah.
and like be able to spit it back for an exam. And like that's what was the key to me, like adjusting a little bit. And I would still do what I did in college was I was lucky enough to have a pretty good memory. And once I heard something, been able to spit it back.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Like everybody's different. I mean, I was making fun of the rainbow highlighting, but you know
if
what?
that
Like, if
works,
it works for you,
if
do
it
it. Like,
works, get out the
do it. I
rainbow.
just, you got to do what works for you, and everybody's different. No one's going to be able to tell you like how you study or prepare for class or prepare for an exam, but it's definitely, you got to do work. I mean, I studied a lot too. When one of the
Right.
exams would came around, like I had like a system where I'll get all my notes and I'd boil it down into a study guide, which was like all the most important shit, just kind of like lined up the right way. And I'd study that. Sometimes you could use those in the exam. They'd let you have it was an open book, which I'd say was about a third of the classes at least at Drexel. I don't know what did they ever let you do open book?
Yes, which and I'll just not to get in the weeds. I never liked open book because it would stress me out more because I would be like it would like I would like I would feel like I would question myself and look at the book, whereas like I knew the answer, so it was almost like too much information for me. I liked kind of going in there and just going with what I knew. But yeah, sometimes let you open books, some do open notes. I remember some doing
Yeah,
letting us do
there was a
outlines.
lot of there was a few open note exams as well. I
But
mean,
you want
the reality is like closed book exams like are not
yeah, it is
examples of real
ridiculous.
life.
It is
Like there's no
ridiculous.
such thing as a closed book trial.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
if whenever I had a trial, I had all of my books right next to me. If I ever had to look anything up in the fly, like
I remember saying that. It's also ridiculous because if you walked into a lawyer's office and they were like, "I do everything by memory,"
oh, I don't need to look anything up. I still look shit up. Like for DU, like I have DUI, I do DUI law, and like I still have to go back and look up all the different penalties sometimes because I just
right,
can't.
and you
I don't want to
should.
remember, and I don't want to tell someone the wrong thing. So, yeah, I would say like law school does not a ton to prepare you for the actual practice of law. That's why you really need to do internships, and there are certain classes that do. Like I would say, like evidence prepares you if you want to litigate.
Right.
Trial advocacy class, but a lot of the classes, like criminal law in law school, was a useless class in my opinion. Like I won't I won't say the name of my professor, but he was he was not that great, and I didn't really learn shit from that class. And now having practicing criminal law, like you say for 100%, like there was nothing I learned in that class
Nothing
that helped
about
me
it.
do my job today, like at all.
I
So
hope he's listening to this podcast right now. I hope it's like I don't know.
wouldn't remember me anyway, probably.
Yeah.
So, But anyway, all right, Donald, I do.
Yeah,
I gotta
so
run,
we'll wrap
but
up. I just thank you, Lewis. Thanks for taking the time. It was really good, and I would tell people check out your website. You're a really smart guy. You helped me get through college, and you do take good notes. So I believe this because I know you do.
I don't remember when you said that. I was like, I
You
guess I
were
did
my
that.
note
I don't
taker.
remember.
So we knew each other. Besides me beating you in constitutional law debates, but we'll end it there. And I can still do that to this day. All right, everybody. Thank you for having me. And thank you for listening. So thanks, Lewis, and bye, everybody. Till next time.
All right, take care, Donald.
All right, bye.